morning, I began, like I always do, by reading the text, and then my theologically trained brain went to work exegeting the text so that I could give you a good expose on Paul, his intentions, and the ongoing feud in the early church over who's in and who's out. Fortunately, it wasn't too long before my common sense stepped in and said, "What the heck are you doing? No one wants this kind of a theological education first thing on a Sunday morning." But you see, that's the problem with Paul. He's complex. He requires explanation. He's a wild card. He doesn't follow the rules. And quite frankly, he's a bit of a jerk too. You can't just point to his letters and say, well, they're in the Bible, so everything he says must be true. If you want to preach on Paul, you have to explain Paul. You have to make apologies for Paul. And frankly, it is a pain in the neck because Paul will throw in everything but the kitchen sink into each and every sentence. For instance, this little snippet that we are focusing on today carries all sorts of weighty theological ideas that demand an explanation, beginning with the word justification. Now, for most of us, justification is one of those churchy words that comes with a lot of theological baggage. But for Paul, the word carried a lot of theological weight. For Paul, justification was a critical concept. So what did he mean when he used the word? You see what I'm saying? We're only 8 words into the passage and already we have to stop and ask a lot of questions. And even if all of the terms and the ideas are defined and understood, various theologies see these concepts differently, so then you have to talk about that. Paul is a preacher's nightmare because his letters do contain a lot of gold, and therefore they cannot be ignored. But you have to do a whole lot of panning to find the gold, and even then, you risk finding nothing more than fool's gold. So we are just going to have to get a little theologically dense today. We are going to have to hear some backstory, but I give you my word, I will try to keep it as simple as possible, because there is some good stuff here, and you deserve to know about it. Today we are reading from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, after having made a brief stopover in chapter 3. At the time of its writing, Paul is in Corinth, and he's planning to travel to Spain via Rome. Now, throughout his entire career, Paul had been in the middle of an ethnic war. Jesus had come to the Jews. Jesus was a Jew. And those who believed him to be the Messiah believed that anyone desiring to be a true follower of Jesus had to convert to Judaism. But Judaism demanded a lot of its converts. Just for starters, there was that whole circumcision thing. Then there were all of the laws that had to be observed. But Paul didn't believe in any of that. He claimed that anyone could follow the Messiah, and they didn't have to convert to Judaism to do it. And that made him extremely unpopular with the Jews. After all, they had observed the laws all their lives. They had said all of the right things, and they'd done all of the right stuff. And now here was this guy saying that none of that was necessary? That anyone who wanted to could be a follower? So Paul wasn't very popular. He was always on the run, and he pretty much got beat to a pulp everywhere he went. When he was in Corinth, he heard that there was fighting in Rome between the Jews and the Gentiles, and that was what prompted his letter to the Romans. They had heard of him, and they had questions about his beliefs and his teachings. So in his letter, he was kind of giving them a resume of who he was and how he saw things. It was a sort of an introductory letter because Paul, as you may recall, was planning a trip to Rome. He never actually made that trip. For some reason, he ended up returning to Jerusalem where he was arrested. He demanded a trial before Caesar, and ironically enough, he did end up going to Rome after all, but he went as a prisoner. But when this letter was sent to the Romans, it was with the explicit understanding that he would be seeing them soon. So we are in the 5th chapter of the letter, and so far Paul has drawn a lengthy comparison between Jews and Gentiles. He says that Gentiles don't properly understand who God is, even though they should, and that Jews understand who God is, but they're no good at doing what God's covenant requires. However, Abraham was justified not by doing what the covenant requires, but by trusting God. Therefore, the only sufficient and necessary criterion for salvation is faith, regardless of religious and/or ethnic identity. And here we are, back at the J word. It would seem that justified is key to everything that Paul has said so far in Romans. And this is one of my struggles with Paul's letters, and the letter to the Romans in particular, because justification is a critical concept here. It cannot be denied that the term has a lot of theological weight to it for Paul, but what did Paul, a well-educated Jew who was smacked in the head with the good news about Jesus, mean by this word? According to the theologian N.T. Wright, the word justification, as used in the Old Testament, signifies that action in a court of law where the judge upholds the case of one of the parties in dispute before him. This is the imagery used in Scripture to represent God's dealings with Israel, with an implication of God's future action in the restoration of Israel's fortunes after she had been oppressed. But in the New Testament, Israel's expectation was radically redefined. In his welcome and inclusion of outcasts and sinners, Jesus enacted God's vindication of all the wrong people in Israel. He said that it would be the poor and the humble who are restored first, not the lawmakers, nor even particularly the law followers. Jesus was sent to the cross for this heresy, but then the resurrection, which was quickly perceived as God's vindication or justification of Jesus and God's redefining of his covenant people around Jesus. The entire Christian mission is built on this foundation, and it is Paul who articulated the conviction and drew out its implications for the entire Gentile population. And it is we who are stunned by its results all these eons later. Paul's words can be taken and used in many hurtful ways, and they have been many times. I don't agree with a lot of his meanderings, and that's okay. He was a person. He was a deep thinker, and at times he was a brilliant theologian, but he was a person with an opinion, same as the rest of us. And that's what you would expect. But as years went by, Paul's doctrine of justification was reapplied in new ways, becoming the magic formula for how one becomes a Christian, leading to the belief that good works are how we earn favor with God. And his atonement theology led to this thing called substitutionary atonement, which maintains that Jesus died to pay a debt that we owed to God. And these theories turn to doctrines which have led to a lot of pain and suffering. In fact, to this day, they still lead to pain and suffering, even if it's just in the form of mental anguish. I don't know where Paul came up with half the stuff that he did, but one thing I do know is that he did not intend all that pain. Paul was like a bull in a china shop, and his theologies were very intense, but Paul was about reconciliation and inclusion and making sure that everyone knew that they had a place at God's heavenly banquet. And at the end of the day, isn't that the thing that we want most in life? Isn't that our greatest hope? To be included, to belong somewhere. Paul's entire theological thesis revolves around the central idea that since the covenant community is no longer defined by the Torah, it is now available to anyone and everyone. He says we are justified or made a member in good standing in the covenant community or heavenly banquet, or however you want to say it, not through the Torah, but in relationship with Jesus. We are justified by faith in the one who died and rose again. Now, I do not proclaim to know what any of this means once and for all, but with this definition, it sure sounds to me like justification is more about belonging than it is about some obscure judgment of personal worthiness. And it sounds to me like belonging or relationship or reconciliation is already ours. It's a gift from God, not something that we have to put on a big show to earn. And while I'm not totally clear on what he meant by the words faith in the one who died and rose again, I do know deep in my soul the longing that each and every one of us feels to belong somewhere, anywhere, just a place to belong. And I know that it is that very longing that is consistently and thoroughly addressed all throughout the Gospels, and then straight through the book of Acts, and then one more time in each and every single one of the epistles. Through all the different voices, in all the differing opinions, the message is consistent. God pulls us into a relationship that is flooded with love first. God chooses us first. And as we drown ourselves within God's love, we find peace and hope and the strength to love others. In other words, we find true belonging. This is true. I know it's true because I have experienced it. And what's more, these texts, all of them, assures us that we can rest in peace with the knowledge that we are a part of God's family or kingdom or covenant community based on who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, not on who we are or what we have done. And we don't even have to thoroughly understand what that means. And I don't. But if there's one thing I know for sure, it is that life is about belonging and connection. Without those things, I died. We all die. Without belonging and connection, humanity would be doomed. We're all looking for some sense of belonging. And through Paul's words, we discover that we are literally swimming in a sea of it all the time. We discover that these things already belong to the faith-filled, not because of some weird substitutionary atonement deal with God, but because Jesus was willing to sacrifice himself rather than exclude anyone from God's love. We see that none of us are perfect, no matter how hard we try, but that does not mean that we are not good enough, even though the world will try to convince us that it does. And that's real. That is something that I can get behind. It is filled with hope, and it's why I'm here talking to you about it in the first place. Paul was one strange dude, and taking him too seriously can lead to some pretty bizarre theology. But at the end of the day, He's the reason that we are all here, still yearning and reaching and hoping for just the tiniest sip of connection to our God and to each other. And Paul reassures us that it is there. All we have to do is take a good and deep drink. And I figured that you might want to know about that this morning. So may it be with you all according to God's word. Amen.